There was a moment when almost all of Europe wanted one man dead. Kings feared him, emperors hated him, entire nations united for a single purpose: to stop Napoleon Bonaparte. Yet every time they thought they had defeated him, he came back stronger. He commanded armies that crossed mountains, shattered empires, and changed the course of history. At just 35 years old, he controlled more of Europe than any man of his generation. To his followers, he was a genius. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. But the most unbelievable part of the story is not how powerful he became. It's how little anyone expected from him in the beginning. Napoleon was not born a king. He did not inherit an empire. He came from a small island that most Europeans could barely find on a map. Nothing about his childhood suggested that one day millions of people would know his name. And yet, within a few decades, he would rise from obscurity to become the most feared man in Europe. How did it happen? How did an outsider challenge kings, conquer nations, and nearly reshape the entire continent? To understand that, we must go back to the very beginning. Back to a rocky island in the Mediterranean Sea. Back to the childhood of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, not in Paris, not in a royal palace, not even in mainland France. He was born on the island of Corsica, a rugged land surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea. For centuries, Corsica had been ruled by foreign powers, and its people were known for their fierce independence. Napoleon entered the world at a moment of uncertainty. Just months before his birth, France had taken control of the island. The future of Corsica and the future of the Bonaparte family was unclear. His family belonged to the local minor nobility. They carried noble titles, but they were far from wealthy. There were no grand estates, no vast fortunes, no powerful connections waiting to open doors for young Napoleon. From the very beginning, he was an outsider, and that feeling would follow him throughout his childhood. When Napoleon was sent to military school in France, he immediately stood out. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent. His classmates mocked him. Some laughed at the way he talked. Others looked down on him because of his background. He was different, poorer than many of the boys around him, less connected, less accepted. For many children, such isolation would have been crushing. But Napoleon responded differently. Instead of trying to fit in, he withdrew into books. History became his refuge. He spent countless hours reading about great commanders, powerful empires, and legendary conquerors. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal, the names filled his imagination. While other boys were focused on fitting in, Napoleon was studying the men who had changed history. Without realizing it, he was preparing for a future no one else could see. The lonely Corsican boy was already beginning to dream of greatness. For years, Napoleon studied, waited, and prepared. But preparation means little without opportunity. And in 1789, opportunity arrived. It came in the form of chaos. The French Revolution exploded across the country. The old world was collapsing. Kings were losing power, nobles were fleeing. Ancient institutions that had stood for centuries were suddenly falling apart. For millions of people, it was a time of fear. For Napoleon, it was a time of possibility. Before the revolution, advancement in the French military often depended on family connections and noble birth. A talented outsider could spend an entire lifetime waiting for recognition. Now everything was changing. The rules that had protected the powerful were breaking apart. For ambitious young officers, doors were beginning to open. Napoleon watched carefully. While others saw disorder, he saw opportunity. While others feared the future, he believed the future belonged to men willing to seize it. His intelligence, discipline, and obsession with military strategy quickly attracted attention. He spent countless hours studying battles from history. He analyzed victories. He analyzed failures. He wanted to understand what separated ordinary commanders from great ones. And unlike many officers around him, Napoleon wasn't interested in tradition. He cared only about results. If an old idea worked, he used it. If it failed, he abandoned it. This practical mindset would later become one of his greatest strengths. But at the time, he was still largely unknown. Just another officer trying to survive one of the most unstable periods in French history. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the city of Toulon, a major uprising threatened the revolutionary government. Royalist forces had seized control of the city. Even worse, they had invited Britain's powerful navy into the harbor. If Toulon remained in enemy hands, the revolution itself could be in danger. The government needed a solution. And soon, a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte would be given the chance he had been waiting for his entire life. The fate of Toulon was about to become the turning point of his career. In 1793, France was fighting for survival. Enemies surrounded the country. Inside France, revolution divided the population. Outside France, powerful monarchies were preparing to destroy the new republic. Among all these threats, one city became especially important: Toulon. Located on the Mediterranean coast, Toulon possessed one of the most valuable naval harbors in Europe. For generations, it had served as a strategic base for the French fleet. Losing it would be a disaster. Yet that is exactly what happened. Royalist forces inside the city rebelled against the revolutionary government. Then they made a decision that shocked France. They handed Toulon to the British. Soon British warships filled the harbor. Foreign soldiers occupied the city, and one of France's most important ports was now under enemy control. The revolutionary government demanded action. Army after army attempted to solve the problem. Progress was slow, plans failed, commanders argued. Weeks passed with little success. Then a young artillery officer arrived. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. At first, few people paid attention to him. He wasn't famous, he wasn't powerful, he wasn't even one of the senior commanders. But Napoleon immediately noticed something others had missed. The key to winning was not attacking the city directly. The key was controlling the harbor. If French forces could capture the heights overlooking the harbor, British ships would be forced to leave. Without British support, Toulon could not survive. To Napoleon, the solution seemed obvious. To everyone else, it seemed impossible. Again and again, he argued for his plan. Again and again, he pushed his superiors to act. Eventually, they agreed. The assault began. French soldiers fought through intense resistance. Cannons thundered across the hills. Smoke covered the battlefield. Napoleon personally directed artillery positions under enemy fire. Several times he came dangerously close to death, but he refused to retreat. Night after night, French forces advanced, position by position, hill by hill, gun by gun. Then came the decisive attack. French troops captured the critical fortifications overlooking the harbor. The moment Napoleon had predicted finally arrived. British commanders understood the danger immediately. Remaining in Toulon was no longer possible. The fleet began to withdraw. One by one, the ships departed. The city had fallen. France had won. And for the first time, people across the country began to notice the young officer responsible for the victory. Napoleon was only 24 years old. His career had changed overnight. The unknown artillery officer had become one of the most promising military leaders in France. But compared to what was coming next, Toulon was only the beginning. Victory at Toulon changed Napoleon's life. For the first time, powerful people in Paris knew his name. The young artillery officer had proven himself, but recognition alone was not enough. France was still at war, enemies still surrounded the Republic, and the government needed commanders capable of delivering victories. In 1796, Napoleon received an opportunity that would change everything. At just 26 years old, he was given command of the Army of Italy. On paper, it sounded impressive. In reality, it was a disaster. The army was exhausted, the soldiers were hungry, many lacked proper equipment. Morale was dangerously low. Some officers doubted their young commander before he had even arrived. Napoleon understood the situation immediately. His army was weaker, his army was poorer, his army was smaller. But Napoleon believed something more important than numbers could decide a war: speed, surprise, and confidence. When he addressed his soldiers for the first time, he promised them something they desperately wanted: victory, glory, and a future beyond endless suffering. Many listened with skepticism. But soon they would discover that their new commander was unlike anyone they had served before. Napoleon moved faster than his enemies thought possible. Instead of fighting large enemy armies all at once, he attacked them separately. Again and again he appeared where no one expected him. Again and again he forced larger armies into retreat. Battle followed battle. Victory followed victory. Within months, the impossible was happening. The starving army that everyone had dismissed was defeating some of Europe's strongest forces. News spread across France. Newspapers celebrated the young general. Citizens followed reports of his victories with growing excitement. The name Napoleon Bonaparte was becoming famous. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was not the victories themselves. It was the speed at which they happened. Entire campaigns that should have taken years were decided in months. Generals who underestimated Napoleon paid a heavy price. Every victory increased his confidence. Every victory increased his popularity. Every victory increased his power. And for the first time, people began asking a dangerous question. What if this young general was destined for something far greater than military success? What if he was destined to rule? The answer would arrive sooner than anyone expected. When Napoleon returned from Italy, he was no longer an unknown general. He was a celebrity. Across France, people followed reports of his victories with fascination. Newspapers printed his name almost daily. Artists painted his image. Writers celebrated his achievements, and ordinary citizens began to see him as something more than a military commander. They saw him as a hero. Every victory in Italy had added to his growing reputation. Every defeated army made him more famous. Every success increased his influence. Soon, Napoleon became one of the most recognizable men in the country. His soldiers adored him. Many believed he cared more about them than the politicians in Paris ever did. Unlike many commanders, Napoleon shared their hardships. He marched with them, he inspired them, and most importantly, he led them to victory. This loyalty would become one of his greatest strengths. But while the public celebrated him, others were becoming increasingly worried. Inside the government, powerful politicians watched Napoleon carefully. They saw a young man with enormous popularity, a man who had won the admiration of the army, a man who seemed to succeed wherever he went. History had shown many times that powerful generals could become dangerous. The question was no longer whether Napoleon was talented. The question was whether he could be controlled. Some believed he would remain a loyal servant of France. Others feared he had ambitions far greater than anyone realized. Napoleon understood exactly what people were saying. He knew his victories had made him famous. He knew his influence was growing. And he knew that fame alone was never enough. He wanted more, much more. The dream that had begun in Corsica was becoming larger every year. No longer satisfied with military success, Napoleon began thinking about greatness, about legacy, about history. He studied the lives of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Both had conquered vast territories. Both had transformed the world around them, and both had become immortal in the pages of history. Napoleon wanted the same. He wanted to accomplish something so extraordinary that future generations would remember his name forever. Soon, an opportunity would appear, an expedition unlike anything he had attempted before. A journey across the Mediterranean Sea, a journey toward Egypt. And the next chapter of his story would become one of the most ambitious gambles of his entire life. By 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte had become the most famous man in France. But fame was not enough. He wanted greatness. He wanted glory beyond Europe. He wanted history to remember him alongside the greatest conquerors who had ever lived. And one name inspired him more than any other: Alexander the Great. More than 2,000 years earlier, Alexander had crossed into the East and built an empire that stretched across continents. Now Napoleon dreamed of doing something similar. Egypt would be the beginning. Officially, the expedition had a military purpose. Britain was France's greatest enemy. Its wealth depended on trade routes that connected Europe to India and Asia. If France could establish control in Egypt, Britain could be weakened. But Napoleon's ambitions reached far beyond strategy. He imagined creating a French empire in the East, an empire that would make him immortal. In May of 1798, the expedition began. Hundreds of ships crossed the Mediterranean. Tens of thousands of soldiers sailed with them. But this was no ordinary military campaign. Napoleon also brought scientists, engineers, artists, scholars. He wanted to conquer Egypt not only with armies but with knowledge. When the French finally landed, they entered a world unlike anything most of them had ever seen. Endless deserts, ancient cities, monuments older than recorded history. Soon the army marched toward Cairo. The heat was brutal, water was scarce. Many soldiers struggled simply to continue moving. Yet Napoleon pushed forward. Then came the Battle of the Pyramids. Facing the famous Mamluk cavalry, Napoleon delivered one of his most memorable speeches. Pointing toward the ancient pyramids, he told his soldiers, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The battle ended in a decisive French victory. The road to Cairo was open. For a brief moment, Napoleon appeared unstoppable. The city fell. His legend continued to grow. But while Napoleon celebrated on land, disaster was approaching from the sea. A British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson had been searching for him. And when Nelson finally found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, everything changed. The battle that followed would become one of the greatest naval victories in British history. Explosions lit up the night. Ships burned. Cannons thundered across the water. By morning, the French fleet was destroyed. Napoleon's army was stranded, thousands of miles from home. Cut off from France. Cut off from reinforcements. Cut off from escape. Many believed the Egyptian adventure was over. Many believed Napoleon's career would die in the desert. They were wrong, because Napoleon was already planning his next move. And that move would bring him closer to power than ever before. While Napoleon remained in Egypt, France was falling apart. The revolution that had promised freedom and stability was struggling to survive. The government was weak. The economy was unstable. Corruption was everywhere. And many citizens were losing faith in the leaders who ruled the country. Every day, the situation grew worse. Back in France, politicians argued. Governments rose and collapsed. Promises were made and broken. The nation was exhausted. Napoleon knew all of this. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. And the reports he received painted a clear picture. France was desperate for leadership, desperate for stability, desperate for someone strong enough to restore order. For Napoleon, the opportunity was impossible to ignore. In 1799, he made a decision that shocked many of his own officers. He would leave Egypt, secretly. The journey itself was dangerous. British warships controlled much of the Mediterranean. Capture was a real possibility. If the British intercepted his ship, his career could end immediately, but Napoleon accepted the risk. He had already begun thinking about something far greater than military victory. Power. When he arrived in France, he expected criticism. After all, he had abandoned an army in Egypt. But instead, he found something completely different. The public welcomed him as a hero. Many people still saw him as the brilliant general who had defeated France's enemies. His popularity remained enormous, and powerful political figures quickly realized that Napoleon could become useful. Very useful. Secret meetings began. Plans were discussed behind closed doors. A group of influential politicians believed the existing government could not survive. They needed change, and Napoleon needed an opportunity. Soon, both sides reached the same conclusion. The government had to go. On November 9, 1799, events moved quickly. Troops loyal to Napoleon surrounded key government buildings. Politicians gathered in confusion. Some resisted, others panicked. Arguments erupted. Accusations filled the halls. For a moment, the entire plan seemed close to collapse. Then Napoleon acted. Using his reputation, his supporters, and the loyalty of the army, he forced the situation in his favor. The old government fell. The revolution had entered a new era. And at just 30 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte became the most powerful man in France. Officially, he was not a king. Officially, he was not an emperor. Officially, France was still a republic. But everyone understood the truth. A new ruler had arrived. And this was only the beginning. After the coup of 1799, France entered a new chapter. Officially, the revolution was still alive. Officially, France remained a republic. Officially, power belonged to the people. But reality was very different. Napoleon Bonaparte now stood at the center of the government. His title was First Consul. The name sounded modest. The power was anything but. For years, France had been trapped in instability. Governments came and went. Political factions fought constantly. The economy struggled. The country was exhausted. Napoleon promised something simple: order. And for many French citizens, that was exactly what they wanted. Almost immediately, he began reforming the nation. Government institutions were reorganized. Taxes became more efficient. Corruption was aggressively targeted. Public administration improved. For the first time in years, many people felt that France was functioning again. Napoleon understood something many politicians did not. Military victories could make a hero, but stability could make a ruler. His reforms extended into nearly every part of society. Roads were improved, infrastructure expanded, industry grew stronger, trade recovered, confidence slowly returned. Perhaps his most important achievement was the creation of the Napoleonic Code. For centuries, laws had often been inconsistent and confusing. Different regions followed different rules. Napoleon wanted a system that applied equally across the country. The new legal code transformed French society. Its influence would eventually spread far beyond France itself. Even today, legal systems around the world still contain ideas inspired by Napoleon's reforms. As his popularity grew, so did his authority. More decisions flowed through him. More power concentrated around him. More people began to view him as the natural leader of France, and Napoleon was beginning to believe it himself. The revolution had overthrown a king. But now France was once again placing enormous trust in a single man. The question was becoming impossible to ignore. How long would Napoleon be satisfied with being first consul? History was about to provide the answer, and it would come in the form of a crown. By 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte had achieved what few people thought possible. He had risen from obscurity. He had defeated France's enemies. He had stabilized the nation. And he had become the most powerful man in the country. But Napoleon was no longer satisfied. The position of first consul gave him enormous authority, yet authority was not the same as permanence. France had already seen governments rise and fall. Revolutions had overthrown kings. Politicians betrayed one another. Power could disappear overnight. Napoleon wanted something stronger, something lasting, something that could survive long after a single political crisis. At the same time, threats against him were growing. Assassination plots emerged. Enemies inside and outside France hoped to remove him. Many of his supporters believed only one solution remained. France needed stability. France needed continuity. France needed an emperor. The idea was controversial. Only a few years earlier, the French Revolution had destroyed the monarchy. Thousands had died fighting against royal power. Now France was considering placing a crown on another ruler. The irony was impossible to ignore. Yet Napoleon's popularity remained enormous. Supporters argued that he was different. Unlike the old kings, he had earned his position. He had risen through talent, determination, and victory. Eventually, a national vote was held. The result overwhelmingly favored Napoleon. The path was now clear. France would become an empire. Preparations began immediately. The ceremony would be unlike anything seen since the Revolution. Churches were decorated. officials gathered from across the nation. Foreign observers watched carefully, and most importantly, Pope Pius VII traveled to Paris. His presence carried enormous symbolic meaning. For centuries, kings and emperors had often received legitimacy through the church. Many assumed the Pope would place the crown upon Napoleon's head. The entire world expected the traditional ceremony. But Napoleon had other ideas. On December 20, 180, thousands gathered inside Notre Dame Cathedral. The atmosphere was electric. Soldiers, officials, nobles, clergy, all waited for the historic moment. The crown was presented, the Pope stood nearby. The ceremony reached its climax. Then Napoleon did something no one expected. Instead of allowing the Pope to crown him, he took the crown himself. Slowly, deliberately. In front of the entire world, he placed it upon his own head. The message was unmistakable. His authority came from no king, no noble family, no church. His power came from himself. The boy from Corsica had become Emperor of France. And now, Europe would have to face him not as a general, but as an emperor. When Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France, the rulers of Europe were alarmed. Many had tolerated the rise of a successful general, but an emperor was something else entirely. To them, Napoleon represented a threat to the balance of power that had existed for centuries. Once again, Europe united against him. Austria prepared for war. Russia joined the coalition. Together, they assembled one of the largest armies Napoleon had ever faced. Their goal was simple: destroy Napoleon, destroy the French Empire, and end his growing influence before it became unstoppable. By late 1805, both sides were moving toward confrontation. The stage was set near a small town called Austerlitz. What followed would become one of the most famous battles in military history. Napoleon knew his enemies outnumbered him. He also knew they believed he was vulnerable. So he decided to use that belief against them. Instead of appearing strong, he appeared weak. He deliberately exposed parts of his position. He allowed enemy commanders to think they had discovered a fatal weakness. The trap was set. The Allied commanders took the bait. Confident of victory, they developed a plan to attack what they believed was Napoleon's weakest flank, exactly as he had hoped. On the morning of December 20, 1805, the battle began. Dense fog covered the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers moved through the cold morning air. Cannons thundered. Infantry advanced. Cavalry charged. At first, everything seemed to be unfolding according to the Allied plan. Then Napoleon struck. The moment he had been waiting for finally arrived. French forces surged toward the center of the battlefield. The attack shattered the enemy formation. Units became separated. Communication collapsed. Confusion spread rapidly through the Allied army. What had seemed like certain victory suddenly turned into disaster. Napoleon's soldiers pressed forward relentlessly. Position after position fell. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. By the end of the day, the Russian and Austrian armies were in full retreat. The victory was overwhelming. One of the most powerful coalitions in Europe had been defeated. And it had been defeated by a man many rulers still underestimated. News of Austerlitz spread across the continent. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a masterpiece. Even Napoleon himself would later regard it as one of his greatest achievements. The Battle of Austerlitz transformed his reputation forever. He was no longer simply a successful emperor. He was now widely considered the greatest military commander in Europe. For a moment, it seemed there was no limit to what he could achieve. But history has a habit of humbling even the most powerful men. And far to the east, a future challenge was already waiting. After Austerlitz, something extraordinary happened. Europe stopped asking whether Napoleon could be defeated. Instead, people began asking whether he could be stopped at all. Kingdom after kingdom fell under French influence. Old alliances collapsed. Ancient dynasties watched their power disappear. Every year seemed to bring another victory, another treaty, another expansion of the French Empire. The map of Europe was changing faster than anyone could remember, And at the center of every change stood Napoleon, the former artillery officer from Corsica, the boy who had once been mocked for his accent, the outsider who never truly belonged. Now kings feared him, emperors negotiated with him, entire nations adjusted their policies because of him. His influence stretched across the continent. Napoleon did more than win battles. He reshaped Europe itself. New governments emerged, old borders vanished. Laws inspired by his reforms spread beyond France. Even those who hated him could not ignore him. His brothers became kings, his allies became rulers, his empire continued to grow. To supporters, Napoleon appeared unstoppable. To enemies, he appeared dangerous. To historians, he would later appear unique. Few individuals in history had accumulated so much power so quickly. Yet success can be deceptive. Every victory increased Napoleon's confidence. Every triumph strengthened his belief in his own judgment, and every year made it harder for him to imagine failure. The world seemed to bend to his will. The impossible had become normal. Victories were expected. Defeat felt unthinkable, but history has a cruel habit. It often punishes those who believe they cannot lose. Beyond the eastern borders of Europe stood an empire unlike any Napoleon had faced before. Vast, powerful, relentless. Russia. Soon, Napoleon would make the most important decision of his life, and the consequences would destroy everything he had built. By 1812, Napoleon stood at the height of his power. He ruled an empire unlike anything Europe had seen in generations. His victories seemed endless. His authority appeared unquestionable. And perhaps most dangerous of all, he had begun to believe in his own invincibility. For years, one nation had refused to fully submit to his vision: Russia. At first, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had cooperated. They had negotiated. They had made promises. They had spoken as allies. But beneath the surface, tensions continued to grow. Russia was suffering under Napoleon's economic restrictions. Trade declined. Frustration increased. Trust disappeared. Eventually, the relationship collapsed. Napoleon became convinced that Russia needed to be brought back into line, and once he made that decision, there was no turning back. The plan was ambitious beyond imagination. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, more than 600,000 men. French soldiers, Polish soldiers, German soldiers, Italian soldiers, troops from across the empire. It was less an army than a moving civilization, stretching for miles across the landscape. Many believed no force on earth could resist it. Even Napoleon's critics were astonished by its size. The emperor was confident, perhaps too confident. He expected a familiar pattern, a rapid campaign, a decisive battle, a negotiated peace. It had worked before, again and again. Why should Russia be any different? On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Neman River. The invasion had begun. As tens of thousands of soldiers marched eastward, bands played music. Flags waved in the wind. Officers spoke of victory. Many expected to be home before winter. Few understood what awaited them. The Russians refused to fight the war Napoleon wanted. Instead of standing their ground, they retreated again and again and again. Each time the French advanced, the Russians moved farther away. Villages were abandoned, supplies disappeared. Food became harder to find. The deeper Napoleon moved into Russia, the larger the problem became. Distances stretched endlessly. Roads deteriorated. Communication slowed. The army kept marching. And Russia kept retreating. Still, Napoleon pressed forward. He believed one decisive victory would end everything. He had built his entire career on that belief. But this time, history was preparing a different lesson. The greatest army in Europe was marching deeper into a land that seemed to have no end. And with every mile, the trap was quietly closing around them. For months, Napoleon's army pushed deeper into Russia. The victories he expected never came. The decisive battle he wanted never appeared. Instead, the Russians kept retreating, drawing him farther and farther from home. Then, at last, the two armies met near a village called Borodino. What followed became one of the bloodiest battles of the 19th century. Cannons thundered across the battlefield. Smoke filled the air. Thousands of men fell within hours. The fighting was relentless. Neither side was willing to give ground. By the end of the battle, the field was covered with the dead and wounded. Napoleon had technically won, but it did not feel like victory. The Russian army survived, and the war continued. Soon afterward, Napoleon entered Moscow. For years he had believed that capturing an enemy capital would end a war. It had worked before. Why not now? But Moscow was different. As French troops entered the city, they found something unexpected. The population had largely disappeared. The city was nearly empty. Then disaster struck. Fires erupted across Moscow. Day after day, flames consumed entire districts. Buildings collapsed. Smoke filled the sky. Napoleon watched as the city he had captured burned before his eyes. The victory he expected had become meaningless. Still, he waited. Surely the Russians would negotiate. Surely peace would come. But it never did. Weeks passed, winter approached, and still no surrender arrived. At last, Napoleon made a decision. The army would return home, but by then, it was too late. The Russian winter had arrived. Temperatures plunged. Snow covered the roads. Food became scarce. Horses died. Supplies vanished. Every day became a struggle for survival. The soldiers of the Grande Armée were no longer marching toward victory. They were fighting to stay alive. Men froze where they stood. Others collapsed from exhaustion. Discipline disappeared. Entire units ceased to exist, and the Russians never stopped attacking. Again and again, they struck the retreating army. Each attack pushed Napoleon's forces closer to destruction. The greatest army Europe had ever seen was dying in the snow. Not because of a single battle, but because of hunger, cold, distance, and one terrible mistake. When the survivors finally escaped Russia, only a fraction remained. Hundreds of thousands were gone. The Grande Armée had been shattered. For the first time in years, Europe saw something it had almost forgotten. Napoleon could be defeated. The disaster in Russia changed everything. For years, Napoleon had seemed unstoppable. Now, for the first time, Europe saw weakness, and Europe moved quickly. Old enemies returned. New alliances formed across the continent. Rulers sensed an opportunity. If Napoleon could be defeated in Russia, perhaps he could be defeated anywhere. Soon, another coalition took shape. Austria joined. Prussia joined. Russia returned together. They prepared for war. Napoleon fought as fiercely as ever. Again and again, he rushed from battlefield to battlefield. Again and again, he achieved victories that seemed impossible. But something had changed. The soldiers he had lost in Russia could not be replaced. The experience he had lost could not be recreated. The empire was beginning to run out of time. In 1813, the coalition armies confronted Napoleon near Leipzig. The battle that followed became known as the Battle of Nations. It was one of the largest battles Europe had ever seen. For days, hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought across the countryside. Cannons thundered. Cities shook. The fate of Europe hung in the balance. This time, Napoleon lost. The defeat was devastating. One by one, his allies abandoned him. The empire that had taken years to build began collapsing within months. Enemy armies advanced toward France itself. Soon, they reached Paris. The unthinkable had happened. Napoleon had lost control of Europe. In 1814, he was forced to abdicate. The Emperor of France gave up his throne. His enemies believed the story was over. Napoleon was sent into exile on the small island of Elba, far from power, far from politics, far from the armies that had once followed him across Europe. For the first time in decades, Europe relaxed. Kings celebrated. Governments congratulated themselves. The nightmare was finally over. Or so they thought, because Napoleon was not finished. Not even close. Less than a year later, he escaped Elba. When news reached France, soldiers were sent to arrest him. The government expected resistance. Instead, something extraordinary happened. As troops confronted Napoleon, He stepped forward alone. According to legend, he opened his coat and spoke directly to the soldiers. "If any man among you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." No one fired. One by one, the soldiers joined him. Then entire units joined him. Then cities joined him. The impossible was happening. Napoleon was taking back France, without a major battle, without an invasion, without an army. Within weeks, he entered Paris. The emperor had returned. Europe could hardly believe it. The man they had defeated, the man they had exiled, the man whose story should have ended, was back. And now only one battle remained, one final chance, one final gamble: Waterloo. Napoleon's return shocked Europe. The impossible had happened. A man who had lost an empire, a man who had been exiled, a man whose story seemed finished, had returned to power. But this time, Europe would not make the same mistake. Across the continent, armies mobilized immediately. Kings, emperors, governments, all understood the danger. As long as Napoleon remained free, peace would never be secure. The coalition moved quickly. They intended to destroy him before he could rebuild his empire. Napoleon knew time was running out. He could not afford a long war. He needed one decisive victory, the kind that had made him famous, the kind that had once changed the fate of nations. So he marched into Belgium. There, near a small village called Waterloo, history waited. The morning of June 18, 1815, arrived beneath dark skies. Rain had turned the battlefield into mud. Movement became difficult. Artillery became less effective. Everything moved more slowly than Napoleon wanted. Still, he believed victory was possible. He had faced impossible odds before. He had defeated larger armies before. He had survived disasters before. Why should this day be any different? As the battle began, French forces pushed forward, again and again. The fighting was brutal. Villages changed hands. Cavalry thundered across the battlefield. Cannons shook the earth. Thousands died. For hours the outcome remained uncertain. Victory seemed possible. Then everything changed. Prussian forces arrived. Fresh soldiers entered the battle. The coalition lines strengthened. The opportunity Napoleon needed began to disappear. His army fought desperately, but the momentum was gone. The battlefield slowly turned against him. For the first time in years, there would be no miracle, no brilliant maneuver, no last-minute victory, only defeat. As evening approached, the French army collapsed. Men fled, units disintegrated. The dream was over. Waterloo was not merely a lost battle, it was the end of an era. Days later, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. This time there would be no return, no second chance, no escape. The man who had once ruled Europe was sent to a remote island in the South Atlantic. St. Helena, thousands of miles from the continent he had dominated. There, surrounded by the ocean, Napoleon spent the final years of his life. Far from battlefields, far from power, far from the empire he had built. He died in 1821. But his story did not die with him. More than 200 years later, the world still remembers his name. Not because he was perfect, not because he always won, but because few people have ever changed history so completely. He rose higher than almost anyone. He fell farther than most could imagine. And somewhere between those two extremes, Napoleon Bonaparte became a legend.